Welcome back. You're watching To The Point. Yesterday evening, the government announced how it will respond to the Supreme Court's decision to cancel 214 coal blocks. It will do so by e-auctioning the blocks, but there will be no right of first refusal for those whose blocks have been cancelled. The government has also announced an intention to permit commercial mining at an unspecified date sometime in the future. So what is the overall assessment of what the government has done, as well as what it proposes to do? Joining me is former Coal Secretary PC Parak, former Power Secretary Anil Razdan, the former Secretary General of FICCI and a well-known economist Rajiv Kumar, and a former advisor to the Finance Minister and now Dean of the Social Sciences School at Shivnadar University, Subhashish Gangopadhyay. Gentlemen, let's start with the steps the government has taken to respond to the Supreme Court's decision to cancel 214 coal blocks before we come to the bigger, wider handling of the coal sector. Subhashish Gangopadhyay, the government has decided to e-auction the coal blocks in tranches, starting with 42 operational blocks and then the 32 that are close to operational. But I am told that in countries like Australia and South Africa, which have a long mining history, coal allocation is not done through auction. It's done by other methods. So is the government wise to opt for auctioning in a country like India? Or do you think it should have thought carefully about this?
Well, if you believe in the market, and this is what we have been doing since 91, moving closer to market-determined solutions, then auction is the way to sell off these blocks, or at least allow these blocks to be exploited. Now, given that we have a Coal India Limited, and given that there are various users of our coal, and given our past history of how coal blocks were allocated, I think auction is the right way to go.
Well, what about the point, and I won't argue it for very long, that a country like Australia that clearly believes in the market, probably much more so than Indian politicians do, does not auction coal blocks, does not auction mining rights. It distributes them or allocates them in other ways.
Well, there are many ways you can distribute it. The auction is the one that comes closest to the marketplace, and if there are more than one demanders of the same coal block, the market way is to auction it.
All right. Rajiv Kumar, the money that's going to be realized from these e-auctions will be paid directly to the states where the mines are located. The major beneficiaries are going to be Jharkhand, Orissa, West Bengal and Chhattisgarh, but states like Madhya Pradesh, Maharashtra and Andhra Pradesh will also benefit. Is that a second wise decision, or do you think the centre should have kept these revenues with itself because the centre perhaps has greater need of them given the fiscal deficit problems and the subsidy burdens the centre has to carry?
Karan, just before answering your question, I would like to say that I am quite impressed with the decisiveness of the central government, because this was an emergency now that you had to raise the coal output and avoid it sort of dragging on like that. On your specific question, I think it's a wise decision again, because it is good to involve and incentivize the states for getting the coal mining done. And let me say that because it is extremely important to increase your coal production as rapidly as much as you can. And I say that because not just because of our demand that is being generated or the shortages, but because coal is in some sense a wasting asset, because we have 300 billion tons of it underground.
Okay.
And by the time we use half of it, the environment would have changed and forced us not to use coal at all. So coal underground coal underground actually represents an asset which is going to waste. And if you want to increase the production as rapidly as possible, it is very useful to get the states on board and incentivize them. So I think I'm very supportive of the government's decision to not mind its fiscal deficit, but to incentivize the state to take quick steps and get on with it.
Now, Mr. Razdan, many analysts had said at the time when in fact the Supreme Court scrapped the 214, that whenever the auction or the reallocation happens, a right of first refusal should be given to those companies that were the original allocators. That hasn't happened. Do you believe that was wise, or do you think that was a little unfair to the original allocators, that they won't have a right of first refusal? They're going to have to bid in an auction like everyone else.
Karan, while answering your point briefly here, I agree that they could have had the right of first refusal in the given circumstances of the case, especially in the case of bona fide investors who had come at the instance of a government policy, it may have been found to be flawed later on. Maybe in some countries we could have amended the law from a retrospective date to accommodate those bona fide cases. However, some analysts, financial analysts particularly, have been talking in terms of auctioning these resources like coal. But it must be borne in mind that this is not to be a revenue generating proposition, in my view, because the idea of giving coal blocks to captive uses like power, etc., was that it was a regulated industry, and you have to procure whether your plant machinery or a fuel, which is a major part of your cost, at the lowest cost.
Can I interrupt you? Can I interrupt you? Is the line of argument you're giving me going to suggest that perhaps the idea of e-auctioning was not a good one? That maybe we should have taken a leaf out of Australia and South Africa and found some other way of doing it?
No, Karan, I'm saying that even assuming you'd gone for an auctioning proposition, I would go for the lowest bidder who is willing to supply coal at the lowest cost for the next 20, 25 years, whatever be the life of that mine.
Okay. In other words, the criteria that wins the auction is not the revenue that is bid, but the guarantee of the price at which power will be sold to the consumer.
Yes, the lowest price, because that is when we are bidding for power, we go for the L1 principle.
That could still happen, Mr. Razdan. We don't know on what criteria the auction will be determined to have been won.
Yes.
The government could still do this. This is good advice which maybe Piyush Goyal is hearing if he's watching the show tonight.
Another issue, Karan, I have one more rider to add here, and that is the point was raised that these revenues going to the state government. I have no problem in going to the state government. In fact, I am one of those who advocates that these revenues should go to the actual area from where the project is going to be located.
Absolutely. Here you agree with the point made by Rajiv Kumar. So let me stop you because you're in agreement with him. Yes. The interesting point where you differ is that the criteria that determines success in the auction is not highest bid so much as guarantee of lowest price of power to the consumer. Let me bring in Mr. Parak. Mr. Parak, the government has said that any company that is convicted by a court will not be able to participate in the e-auction. But Mr. Jaitley pointedly added that companies that merely face charges will not be debarred. Now, what happens if a company wins a block in an auction and then later on gets convicted? Because that could theoretically happen.
Well, if ultimately it is convicted, the government can always withdraw that coal block from that company.
But on what grounds? Because after all, the conviction is not related to the coal block that they've acquired, it's related to an earlier incident. So if you're punishing them for an earlier incident, you can't do that in terms of something that happened subsequently.
But the point is that when a company has indulged in a fraud, the government is entitled to take back the coal block.
But it would have indulged in a fraud in an earlier instance, not in this instance. The two are separate auctions, the two are separate transactions.
That's fine, but the point is that this is one of the conditions that people who are involved in the fraud will not be allowed to participate. And if the fraud is discovered after this also, I think there is nothing wrong in the government deallocating those.
All right. Let me now move to this question of the extent to which compensation will be made available. Subhashish Gangopadhyay, the land on which the line to Subhashish is down. Let me put that to you, Mr. Kumar. Mr. Kumar, the land on which the mines are to be allocated will be, in fact, sorry, I'll begin that again. The land on which the mines are located will be allocated to the company that wins the e-auction at a price to be decided by a competent authority. That then will be paid in turn to the original allocatee. So as far as the land is concerned, the original allocatee will be compensated. But what about the original allocatee's investments? Who's going to compensate that company for the investments? Do you think that issue has been adequately handled?
No, I'm not sure at all. I don't think it has been handled because there are some, as Mr. Razdan said, some bona fide investors who had who had created no malafide and therefore invested in good faith. And if they have done that, therefore, they need to be compensated for the investment that they have made. And which is what brings me to the issue that while I laud the decisiveness with which the government has acted. I wish they had spent more time and dealt with the issue more comprehensively, so that the entry of the private sector and the issue of investment, compensation, etc., had all been dealt. But let me also add here that I actually disagree with Mr. Razdan on this lowest price thing, because there you need to then specify the environmental and the technology conditions under which coal will be exploited. Because coal is not electricity generation, and as you've seen in iron ore, the lowest bidding processes can bring spurious miners, which will not attract the best mining companies. I take your point, and we'll be back in the situation that you are at the moment.
I take your point, Mr. Kumar, but let's not get deflected and talk about what should be the criteria that determines the auction, because in a sense that's a detail. Let me put you a consequence of the point you made, that you don't think adequate attention and care has been given to the subject of compensating original allocatees who have made investments. And the corollary is this: if they are not compensated for their investments, in turn the loans they've taken from banks will not be repayable, and then those loans will end up becoming non-performing assets. And the Business Standard today estimates that 3 lakh crore of bank funds could be stuck due to deallocation of coal blocks. Now, is that a second level of problem which the government hasn't addressed?
It is a problem, and there is a backup, for these loans, because a lot of these, I'm not sure about the 3 lakh crores, but being on the board of the State Bank of India, I know that a lot of credit is now been given to these investors who got their coal mines, and so there is an issue here, because there is no fault of theirs that they have invested here. And I think, therefore, I would have preferred that this statement in the ordinance, that they will allow the entry of private companies at some unspecified date, should have been actually dealt with now, and the Coal Nationalization Act be thoroughly amended and actually reversed, so that none of this would be ultra-virus, and the original non-mala fide investors, they continue to operate those mines which they have got and in which they have invested, and produce the coal on good account and in good faith.
Mr. Kumar, I'm going to take up that point you're making in a big way in a moment's time, because I think that is to do with, in fact, the second stage of our discussion, the future the government intends for the coal sector as a whole. Let's, for a moment, Mr. Parakh, still concentrate on the first subject, which is how the government is responding to the Supreme Court's decision to cancel 214 blocks. Now, there are 42 functioning mines, and the Supreme Court has given those 42 mines a 6-month grace period. Do you think the e-auction and all the other formalities can be completed within that period, so that coal production from these mines doesn't stop? Because if it does stop, potentially coal production worth some 40 million tons a year could be hit, leading to an increase of coal imports of some 23–24%, which could have a very damaging impact on the country's current account deficit. So, is 6 months sufficient in India to ensure that the transfer happens, new people carry on, and coal production doesn't get a hit?
Well, the speed with which the government has brought in the ordinance shows that government is very serious about dealing with the problem coming out of Supreme Court's judgment. And the minister has given an indication that in next 3 to 4 months' time they will try to see that allocation process is completed. My view is that even for some reason the matter gets delayed a little, government will certainly ensure that the operating mines are not closed because of any delay. There are several ways in which government can handle this situation. The government can ask for extension of time from the court. Government can also give these mines temporarily to Coal India and allow the current operators to continue to act as MDOs. There are several ways in which the problem can be handled. I am sure government will ensure that the coal mines are not closed.
All right. So in other words, basically there are many options if in fact the 6-month time period proves to be too short, to ensure that in fact coal production doesn't suffer. Let's then, gentlemen, come to the bigger, wider second subject. Mr. Razdan, I want to focus now on what the government intends in terms of the future of the coal sector as a whole. The proposed ordinance will have an enabling provision which will permit introduction of commercial mining at a later date. But the government doesn't say when this will happen or how soon. So at the moment, this is just an expression of intent. As a former power secretary, is that satisfactory or do you find it disappointing?
That the government has had to act a little bit in haste because they had to get over that 6-month deadline or make an earnest effort to get over that 6-month deadline given by the Supreme Court. Because I would have personally expected the government to go in for a wholesale revision of the coal mining scenario, allow private sector entry, and responding again to what Rajiv said that about L1 not conforming to environmental laws. Or
let's not go down that.
I just must make this point.
I'm stopping you, Mr. Razdan. Let's not go back to that debate about what sort of auction we should happen. Let's consider that a detail for the government to decide. Stick to this issue. Are you worried or concerned that the government has only expressed intent about commercial mining, not setting a date and therefore not saying when it will happen?
I would have been happy if government had set a roadmap and said that maybe in the next 4 months, 6 months, we'll come out with a comprehensive legislation to allow that to happen, because that really is the core of the whole issue.
Okay.
Because even today, if you give it to national entities or to state entities to mine, there's some of these electricity boards or state generating companies who may get these mines are in no position to do coal mining. They will have to get an MDO or some coal producer. They are generators of power. They are not miners of coal.
Absolutely. And so you would prefer the government to have gone whole hog rather than simply take a small step. I want to bring in Subhashish Gangopadhyay. My apologies, we've had a little bit of trouble with that OB to you. We're talking, Subhashish Gangopadhyay, about what is essentially just an expression of intent, that there will be an enabling provision which will enable commercial mining at a later date, but it's not specified and we don't know when that will happen. Now, this is what the Economic Times says. Bold reform is envisaged, but postponed to an indeterminate future. All this is messy and sadly below what needs to be done and what can be done. And then the paper adds, when the government has so much political capital at its disposal, why should it drag its feet on bold reform that is eminently doable? Do you agree with the paper, which is basically criticizing the government for not being bold, for being only taking half steps at a time?
Well, these are matters of perception. The important thing is that the government has announced that we are going to allow the commercial coal mining. So that's a very good thing. And as was just pointed out, that power sector firms or cement firms may not be the best miners of coal. So you obviously need more expertise in coal mining. So in that sense, the government's commitment to allow this sort of coal mining is a very good thing. Now, about when they should have said it, why, at what point of time must they make the legislation, all of that is something that we must wait and see how it turns out. The auctions are not going to be held tomorrow. So there is enough time to work that thing out. I don't think we should be so worried about the timing of commercial coal mining. The fact that the government has announced that it wants to do it is in itself a very good signal. It allows for positioning, it allows for the political debate to take place, because mind you, Coal India Limited has a monopoly. So in that sense, I think it is a very good thing that the government has done, and it's just treading waters. It is just seeing what the political backlash is for making this announcement. And I do think, for exactly the reasons that were said by Mr. Razdan, that it will have to be done in many instances commercially. It is only consistent with the auctioning process, right, that you will need efficient miners of coal, otherwise the pricing won't be correct.
Let me bring you in, Rajiv Kumar. You've heard a very sympathetic answer from Subhashish Gangopadhyay, who's very pleased that a clear-cut expression of intent has been given. He's prepared to give the government time, in the belief that compulsions as well as the government's own commitment will lead to commercial mining happening sooner rather than later. I want to put the opposite view to you. To what extent is this in fact just a half step rather than full-fledged reform? Much like the way the government handled retrospective taxation, where it hasn't scrapped it, it simply promised it won't implement it. Much like the way it's handled labour reforms, where it's done one or two small but valuable things, but it hasn't gone down the full hog. Much like the confusion in the government over land acquisition amendments, where they're talking not about amendments, simply increasing exemptions. Do you think this is a half step and that maybe the government should have been bolder?
Well, Karan, I'm quite clear in my mind that this government will follow the Chinese practice of crossing the river by feeding the pebbles under its feet. So it will not take those big leaps and big bang reforms, and this is in line with that, which is that they want to, they want to test the waters, they want to sort of, get the political debate, etc. But the key, as Subhashish and Mr. Razdan said, is that they have to actually convince all of us that they are moving in that direction. But because Coal India Limited has not been able to raise its output in the last 3 years, it's been stagnant in its output. And what I want to hear from the government is that they are not at all committed to turning Coal India around, because that would mean that that's a battle that they will lose. But the second point that I wanted to make is that suppose in your e-auction you again get a bidder which is not as Supreme Court defined, a central government agency to run the mine, and you get you get a cement producer, etc. The Supreme Court has made it clear that the Coal Nationalization Act does not permit that. So then you are confining yourself to those bidders who conform to the Supreme Court judgment. And
which is narrowing
work at all.
Which is narrowing the horizon considerably. I take your point. Let me bring in Mr. Parak. Mr. Parak,
to that extent,
I take your point. To that extent, in fact, this government is defeating its own purposes of changing the whole coal sector. Mr. Parak, let me bring you in and put this to you. When I look at what Mr. Modi's done in terms of political decisions, particularly contesting Maharashtra and Haryana on his own, he was a risk taker. He was a man who took a calculated gamble and he followed it through with passion and commitment and enormous energy. When I look at what Mr. Modi is doing on the economic front, he's testing the water, he wants to feel the pebbles before he crosses the river, to use that lovely metaphor from Mr. Kumar. He's suddenly cautious, he's suddenly slow. Isn't there a paradox between the two? A risk taker when it comes to politics, cautious and safe and slow when it comes to economics.
Well, in my view, there is absolutely no risk in opening up coal sector for commercial mining. From 2000 onwards, there has been broad political consensus about opening up coal sector for commercial mining, as the bill for opening up coal sector was put in the parliament in Rajya Sabha in 2000 itself. So there has been a broad political consensus on bringing about this amendment. So I don't think there was any big risk in taking up this stand.
Which is very interesting, Mr. Parak, because the conclusion you're coming to is that, in fact, Mr. Modi has been slow and cautious in an area where there was no risk and no need to be slow and cautious, because you're saying there was a consensus for opening up fully rather than doing it by half steps and half measures. A quick yes or no, because we're out of time. A quick yes or no. You can't hear me? Oh dear. Well, that was clearly what Mr. Parak was saying. Sadly, he's not there to confirm it with a yes, but that was clearly what he was suggesting. He was simply saying that, and he was adding to the paradox, that in fact, this is an area where the Prime Minister could have been bolder, because there would have been no resistance if he had been. My thanks to all my guests, and once again, my apologies to Subhashish Gangopadhyay for that malfunctioning OB. There we end this particular episode. If you have been, thanks for watching. Goodbye. Good night.